Yesterday's lecture covered about 2,400 years, from the start of the first recorded Chinese dynasty, the Shang, in 1500 BCE, to the end of the Tang dynasty around 900 CE. We're going to slow down today, but not much. I've mentioned in 2 lectures now that the Tang dynasty was officially Buddhist, and that Tang rulers supported Buddhist monasteries and served as patrons of much Buddhist art. Another important form of art that emerged around this period, actually a little before the Tang dynasty, was the painted scroll. This non-required work is a hand scroll, which was horizontal and was meant to be unrolled and studied. Hand scrolls were usually made of silk, although as paper technology improved, more would be made of paper. They were read from right to left. Since we're getting close to the semester final, let me throw out a review question. What other art that we've studied needs to be read right to left? Well, there's the Quran, written in Arabic, and the Golden Haggadah, written in Hebrew. Another right-to-left work will show up in my lecture on Japan. The Chinese considered calligraphy to be a higher art than painting, partly because the Chinese valued the written word so highly, and partly because calligraphy revealed the artist's status as a cultured and educated man. It was no small feat to master the 4,000 or so characters of Chinese. Frequently, calligraphy was added to a scroll, contributing some words of poetry or commentary. Now that you've learned something about Chinese art and culture, what message would you guess that the artist was trying to send? Well, it seems likely that these portraits of 13 previous emperors were meant to impress upon the younger members of the royal court the majesty of their forebears and the necessity of learning from their experiences. Do you remember the Junzi, the Confucian ideal man? One Junzi ideal is a gentleman scholar who has mastered the arts of music, poetry, calligraphy, painting, and literary composition, and, if he's lucky, obtained a high government position by performing very well on the exams that demonstrated a mastery of Confucian texts. This is art of the Junzi. The Tang dynasty fell in 907 CE, and for about half a century, China splintered once again into smaller states. In 960, much of China was reunited under the Sung dynasty. Gradually, non-Chinese people from the north and west took over chunks of northern China, but the south remained under the control of the Sung for about 150 more years. Despite the constant threat of invasion and continued military weakness, culturally, this was a vibrant time for the Chinese. Scroll painting remained a very important art form, especially at the emperor's court, but the Sung dynasty saw the emergence of landscape painting as a dominant genre. These also are not required works, but Li Cheng was considered one of the great masters of this art form. The work on the left is a hanging scroll. It was supported by a pole and hung for a time on a wall. Scrolls were not hung for long periods. They weren't really wall art, but works intended for more intimate study and contemplation. Note that both paintings include those colophons in beautiful calligraphy. Of course, decorated text was not purely a Chinese phenomenon. Think of the Quran and illuminated manuscripts. Just for fun, I've included the work on the bottom right, which is Mary, Queen of Scots' personal prayer book or breviary, with her own personal notes, and she carried it to the scaffold when she was beheaded. Still, the rise of landscape painting as opposed to portrait painting may also have reflected some important social and intellectual changes that were taking place in China at the time. Land-owning aristocrats were still a dominant force in China, but the exam system was giving rise to something of a meritocracy. Occasionally, a very bright young man of less elevated birth would rise to the top through sheer brilliance. It was kind of hard for those families to afford an exam or in the study for an exam, but it did happen sometimes. These individuals, both those from lower social echelons and those from higher social echelons. In other words, the individuals who had succeeded in this study came to be known as the Literati, and they would remain a dominant force in Chinese society for several hundred years. Note that these paintings reflect both a study and an exaggeration of nature. The mountains are even more towering, the trees even more gnarled than they would probably appear in real life. These kinds of paintings are often referred to as monumental landscapes, basically because they are huge and because they represent natural forms as huge. Okay, finally, I'm going to get to a required work, but I felt I needed to give you some context because part of what makes this work important and Fan Kuan so important are the ways he broke with Li Chang and other landscape painters whose work he had earlier apparently admired and imitated. We don't know a lot about Fan Kuan, but apparently he was an academy painter attached to the court who decided to leave court, leave civilized life, in fact, and to live as a recluse in the mountains. Fan Kuan was a follower of Taoism. So how does Taoism show up in his work and in his personal decisions in life? Well, the focus on living in nature and developing one's inner life is very Taoist, but Fan Kuan is also associated with another very Chinese synthesis known as Neo-Confucianism. This gets very deep and complicated, and I'll be honest, even after a lot of reading and research, I'm not sure I get it myself, especially the difference between portraying nature directly and portraying nature's Li and Qi. So, let's try to wrap our minds around it this way. I'm going to show you two required works from later in our course, from the 19th century, one from the United States and one from Mexico. Both are examples of romanticism, of romantic landscapes. So here's the U.S. work, an example of what's called the Hudson River School. Stay tuned, we'll get there. And here's a Mexican painting from a little later, but still representing the same art historical period, Romanticism. So what do these two works have in common with Fan Kuan's landscape, which I'm assuming you have open in your workbook? Well, they're both dramatic. They both include strong values, that is, contrasting shades of light and dark, although, of course, Fan Kuan's ink painting is monochromatic, single color, and these are colored brightly. All three even include tiny human figures. In each work, the humans are portrayed as part of nature, but also fundamentally dwarfed by nature. The figure on the upper left, by the way, is a self-portrait of the artist, Thomas Cole. The mule train on the bottom from Fan Kuan's painting may be a group of pilgrims traveling to a Taoist or Buddhist monastery. They were usually located in the mountains. But Fan Kuan's painting plays with our perspective in a way that the other two really don't. The painting is essentially divided, you'll see, into three registers. Remember Lady Di? And each is painted with different brushstrokes, each presenting a somewhat different perspective. Moreover, each area of light and dark occupies different spaces. The spaces don't really seem to connect. And finally, we see distinctly different brushstrokes employed in different sections of the painting. So in the foreground, at eye level, we see what one art historian calls, and I quote, crisp, well-defined brushstrokes, unquote. The misty large area, central area with the mountains is executed in a pale ink wash that's produced by diluting ink with water, sometimes by putting ink onto wet surfaces. And what are called raindrop texture strokes are used to capture the vertical cliffs. Notice that it seems to be kind of dripping down. The artist also uses different kinds of brush strokes to portray different kinds of trees. Okay, this may seem far-fetched, but I see some similarities between these works. The one on the left, by the way, is a very important work of European art. So, what do you think I might be seeing? Well, like Fan Kuan, Cézanne uses value, light and dark, to separate out his picture planes. He also plays with our perspective. We'll talk about that more when we get to this work. And in some ways, his color blocks play the same role as Fan Kuan's different brush strokes and ink blotches. This, I promise, is our last Back to the Future moment, at least for now. By the time we get to our whopping 27 global contemporary works, which I will tell you up front I think is too many, we're all going to be gasping for breath. So I've been trying to introduce some of these works earlier. So why do you think I put these two works together? What do they have in common? The artist of the work on the left is Korean, not Chinese, but inkwash or literati painting was very popular in Korea as well as China, as you'll hear soon. Korean art was heavily influenced by developments in China. This artist was quite deliberately using traditional Asian inkwash methods, even though the work also reflects the influence of 20th century abstract art. Stay tuned. So you notice those raindrop shapes and the pale inkwash diluted with water. According to Khan Academy, one of my major sources, Sung Sunam was a leader of Korea's Sumukwa, or Oriental ink movement in the 1980s. Sumukwa is the Korean word for the Chinese word for inkwash painting, which is also called literati painting. Think maybe the College Board will ask you to draw that connection? I would not bet against it. The Wikipedia entry, on inkwash painting includes this very interesting quotation from an early 20th century American artist who was influenced by Asian inkwash paintings. He said, "The painter put upon the paper the fewest possible lines and tones, just enough to cause form, texture, and effect to be felt. Every brush touch must be fully charged with meaning and useless detail eliminated." This minimalism, as we'll see, will influence later art, particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries. Next dynasty, please. The Chinese name notwithstanding, the Yuan dynasty was the first foreign dynasty to rule China, and it ruled until 1365. So the first ruler of the Yuan dynasty was Kublai Khan, who was grandson of famed conqueror Genghis Khan, the Scourge, and host to Marco Polo, whose descriptions of China under Kublai Khan, most Europeans didn't really believe this couldn't be true, but certainly excited a young fellow named Christopher Columbus. The Mongols don't have a very good rep, and sometimes for good reason. But Mongol rule actually brought some important benefits to China. For art history, in fact, it was mostly good news, and this map tells you why. Any guesses? Basically, the Mongol Empire was divided up among Genghis Khan's grandsons, but they were sufficiently united to protect traffic on the Silk Road. You see that in red. With trade routes secure, economic and cultural exchange flourished in this period, even if many of the literati lost their jobs and withdrew to their country homes to pout. Consider the Pax Mongolica. It was the Yuan dynasty that moved China's capital to Beijing, by the way, closer to their Mongolian home. Now, the David vases are probably the best-known porcelain vases in the world, mostly because of the rare inscription around their necks, which tells exactly when they were produced in 1351 and for what purpose. They were named, by the way, after a famous British collector who bought them up in the 1920s when the Chinese empire was disintegrating and the palace eunuchs started selling off imperial art. He donated them to the University of London, which lent them to the British Museum. We know from the inscription that these were originally altar vases commissioned by a man named Zhang Wenjin and presented as an offering to a Taoist temple. But the vases also tell, in kind of a microcosm, the story of art and the Yuan dynasty. We now think of blue and white porcelains as quintessentially Chinese, but this archetypal Chinese aesthetic actually comes from Iran, where it had long been popular. Remember that mihrab that originally stood in an Isfahan mosque? It's from about the same period. Chinese merchants were eager to sell to this rich market, and with Mongol armies guarding the Silk Road, they could actually get their goods to market safely. Iranian mines gave Chinese the cobalt they needed to put the blue into their porcelain. What the Chinese brought to the exchange was new porcelain technology. Now, the technology had long existed to produce fine porcelain, which is made from kaolin, Kaolin, I should have put that on the slide, or fine white clay. But adding color decoration presented a serious problem because there were few substances that could withstand the high temperatures that were needed to fire the kaolin into porcelain. In the Yuan period, Chinese ceramicists discovered that ground cobalt could be mixed with water and painted on an unfired piece of porcelain. In the kiln, the blackish pigment turned a rich shade of blue. This innovation began the famous tradition of blue and white ware, which for centuries would be created for markets not only in China, but in the Muslim countries and in Europe, where it was very popular. Copper oxide was also used successfully as a decorative agent in the same way, which created the class of porcelains known as underglazed red. And on the right, you see a Yuan vase that actually uses, or jar, that uses both of those. The imperial kilns in Jiangxi province, you see them, they still exist, became the most renowned center for porcelain, not only in China, but in all the world. I've mentioned that the David vases were made for a Taoist temple, so the imagery is not surprisingly very Chinese. We see our old friends, the phoenix and the dragon. These items were not made for the imperial household, but the phoenix and dragon nevertheless traditionally represent the empress, that's the phoenix, and the emperor, respectively. But what is their significance in Taoist terms? Well, the phoenix is often seen as representing the yin, or passive feminine energy, and the dragon represents the yang, or masculine active energy. Forgive me, ladies. Remember, I am not a Taoist. In my experience, women have plenty of active energy. Oops. Sorry about that. This is one of those build slides that I borrowed. Oh, Piglet jumps around. I love this. I borrowed this from someone else. At any rate, if you wonder where the English word porcelain comes from, art historians think the answer is Marco Polo. When he saw porcelain in China, it reminded him of the smooth whiteness of the cowrie shell, which, probably another reminder, is called porcellana. In Italian, that means piglet. So, where and when would you guess this was made? Did I fool you? The answer is Delft, Holland, around 1725. Chinese porcelain was enormously popular in Europe, and it fetched very high prices. A lot of it was brought to Europe by Dutch merchants who controlled a lot of the trade with the East in this period. Well, eventually the enterprising and technologically adept Dutch, stay tuned for oil paint, figured out how to make it themselves, and they even sometimes borrowed Chinese images and sometimes didn't. Since we're heading into the Ming dynasty anyway, let me throw in still another non-required work and kind of round out the story of porcelain. The Chinese were not actually as mad for blue and white as the Iranians or the Dutch. Yellow, red, and green are considered the lucky colors in China, but these did not work with the technology until the Chinese came up with a new technology. Instead of using an underglaze and then firing white kale and clay at very high temperatures, they used melted glass or enamel as an overglaze. That's actually a technique somewhat similar to cloisonne. Remember cloisonne? So I'm going to pause here so that I don't choke YouTube. In my final, I hope much shorter lecture on Chinese art, I will talk about the Forbidden City and the formidable Chairman Mao.